I'm delighted to welcome you to the Global Week debate, Nottingham Trent University. My name is Becky Huxley-Binns, and I'll introduce the debaters in a moment. But before we start, and in order to determine who wins the debate, I'm going to start by asking you to vote. The motion is where there is a public interest, even sensitive state information should be placed in the public domain. If you agree with this statement at this stage, please will you press button 1/A, and if you disagree, please will you press button 2/B. They haven't started yet, Anton has to click it.
Oh, sorry.
Have you clicked it?
Yeah, it's working. So
It's working.
What about undecided?
Please, were you going to inform me? Go with your instinct. What does your gut tell you at this stage? Because this really matters. Sorry.
Just a thought, sorry, I didn't mean to...
Not in the slightest. There is no don't know, because we can't counter swing from a don't know to a no. Even though, ironically, as an educational establishment, that's exactly what we should be doing.
Becky, do we keep pressing or do we just press once?
It will only be for once. Has everybody voted? Wow. So in favour, 37%, and it adds up to 100. Yes. That was my first concern.
Fully transparent.
And it is fully transparent. On behalf of Nottingham Trent University, I am delighted to welcome Peter Tatchell to the university for this debate. Peter has been campaigning for human rights, democracy, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender freedom and global justice since 1967. He's a member of the human rights group Outrage and is also the Green Party's spokesperson on human rights. Through the Peter Tatchell Foundation, he campaigns for human rights in Britain and internationally. Peter is arguing for the debate motion, and I'm inviting him to speak for up to 20 minutes in favour.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pay tribute to Nottingham Trent University for organising tonight's debate, and hope there'll be one of many to come. My starting point with this motion before us is the case of Chelsea Manning. I'm sure you're all aware that Chelsea Manning blew the whistle on war crimes and cover-ups by the US military in Iraq and Afghanistan. She revealed information that had been hidden by the US state and military, hidden from the American people. In my view, Chelsea Manning's revelations were a public service in the public interest. She helped shine a light on things that were happening, things that were being done in the name of the American people, which the American people had not been allowed to know. Her actions were based on the fundamental democratic principle that citizens have a right to know what governments are doing in their name. Governments are servants of the people, or should be. We should not be subject to the state should be subject to the people's will. And part of the people's will is knowing what is going on, being informed. I don't believe that Chelsea Manning should be in prison. Instead, the US government should put on trial those American military personnel who murdered innocent civilians and those in the US military who covered up and protected them. For many Americans, not all, but for many Americans, Chelsea Manning is a true patriot, not a traitor. She reveres the founding ideals of the United States, an open, honest government accountable to the people. That's what she sought to put into practice. The idea that the American government should be accountable to the American people. She exposed war crimes and other crimes against humanity that had been kept hidden. And these, in my view, are the characteristics of a person of conscience motivated by idealism and altruism. It is thanks to Chelsea Manning that the American people and people worldwide now know the truth. We know the truth, the state secrets that were hidden from us. To me, democracy without knowledge is not democracy at all. A secret state cannot be a democratic state. Indeed, a secret state is a threat to democracy. It subverts the democratic process by denying the people, who are the ultimate arbiters of government, the right to know the truth. For any democracy to function effectively, the people must be informed. The people must know what governments are doing in their name and why. They must know the evidence on which government decisions are made, so they can assess whether that evidence justifies the policy. It is, in my view, in the public interest for people to know. And that's why I'm supporting tonight's motion. We have in this country a Freedom of Information Act. It's flawed and imperfect. It doesn't always work, but it does enshrine a fundamental principle, which is that the people need the freedom and right to know the facts in order to make informed decisions. To decide whether or not a policy is right, people need to know the fact. They need to be able to make an informed decision. And that requires access to information. So as a basic fundamental principle, as much information as possible should be put in the public domain. That is in the interest of the public. The public interest is for the public to know. We've all heard in recent months of the mass state surveillance of innocent private citizens by the National Security Agency in the United States and by GCHQ, Britain's spy agency, as well. We never knew what these agencies were doing until the revelations of Edward Snowden. If he hadn't blown the whistle, to this day, we would not be aware of the vast scale of interception of private communication. These revelations have given us a whole new lexicon. Prism, tempora, dishfire, bull run, Edgehill, upstream, all top secret programs of state spying on you and me and millions of other citizens around the world. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions. These programs snoop on our text messages, our emails, our phone calls, our social media postings on Facebook. These are a blanket intrusion into people's right to privacy, an indiscriminate, disproportionate intrusion about which we knew nothing because we have a secret state. A state that is put there by the people, supposedly, through democratic elections, but which is not accountable to the people. Where so many of its operations are governed by the state's own self-interest and self-preservation, not by the public's right to know. There was, of course, no parliamentary debate in Britain or in the US Congress about the creation of these secret state snooping programs. Never any debate at all, let alone approval. And it's astonishing to hear the expressions of disbelief of members of Parliament in Britain and congressmen and women in the United States when they've heard the scale of secret programs agreed by the White House and the security agencies. That is not compatible with democracy. Secrecy and democracy are mutual enemies. Now, of course, lots of information is withheld on the grounds that it's sensitive, as the notion suggests. But sensitivity is often a cover for it would be embarrassing for the government if this came out. We must protect certain ministers or certain officials or certain state agents who have done a particular thing. Just cast your mind back to the revelations last year about British colonial policy in Kenya during the War of Liberation in the 1950s. There was a wholesale policy of detention without trial, torture, castration, rape, and even murder that was covered up for more than half a century. And only thanks to a very, very, very dedicated researcher did it come to light that these files have been sitting secreted away at a special place out of public view. If the British public had known what the British colonial administration and military forces were doing in Kenya in the 1950s, they knew about the war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think the British public would have taken a very different view. But they were not allowed to know because the state deemed that this information was sensitive. It was sensitive information because it amounted to British collusion with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, it is in the public interest that we knew that information then and there, never mind more than half a century later. The same grotesque abuses happened in Malaya, Aden, Cyprus, and other colonial jurisdictions. They haven't yet come out. Still to this day, the government is sitting on that information. The terrible, terrible things we did to colonial peoples whose only crime, in inverted commas, was to seek freedom and self-rule. Even closer to home, the full truth has never come out about the secret dirty war in the north of Ireland. British state collusion with loyalist death squads. Some of it has come out, but not all of it. To this day, we don't know what the SAS was secretly doing with their undercover squads in north of Ireland. We know from some whistleblowers that the SAS was involved in the assassination of Republican sympathisers and activists, some of whom had a very tenuous connection, if any at all, to armed insurrection and violence. We know many, many people who've been murdered where in those trials it has come out that the British state looked the other way, knowing that loyalist death squads were targeting Republicans. We have a right to know that information. And again, if it had been known at the time what was happening, if the full scale of torture that was happening in the H blocks and in Longkesh internment camp in the early 1970s, if that had been known, the British public might have taken a very different view about the war in Ireland. So for me, it is absolutely vital that what governments do in our name and what their agents do in our name, why government policy is the way it is, why the decisions are made, on what evidence they're made, these are all matters in the public interest. The public need to know in order for the public to be able to decide whether or not government policy is right and justified. If you look at a range of controversial issues, immigration and asylum, welfare recipients, Europe, global warming. Successive governments have time and time again sought to diminish the information we know, or failed to correct the misinformation put out by others when it suited their purpose. So, for example, when the Daily Mail screams in sensationalist inflammatory headlines about immigration and asylum or about Europe, half the time the government will be reluctant to take them on, to provide the counter-information to rebut those allegations, because they fear the reaction of the Daily Mail. They feel it'll be bad for potential voters, it'll look bad for potential voters if they take on the Daily Mail in these controversial issues. I would argue they should be giving the facts, the full facts, and challenging those who spread misinformation. Because at the end of the day, we can't make a judgment about these controversial issues unless we know the full facts. I'd say there should be a default position that the public have a right to know unless there are very strong, compelling reasons why not. I don't think sensitivity in the motion, I don't think sensitivity is itself a justification. Matters may be sensitive, issues may be sensitive, but that is no excuse in itself to deny people the right to know. I've had some recent experience. Many of you will know that recently Alan Turing, the great mathematical computer genius, was given a posthumous pardon, which I welcomed. But I was also very concerned that the full circumstances of his death, allegedly suicide, had never ever properly been investigated. To this day, there's never been a proper, full, open inquiry into the circumstances of Alan Turing's death. I wanted to know from the government, was he under pressure from the security services? Had he been put under surveillance by the security services? Had he been recommended for special surveillance and prohibitions on his work by the security services? Had they met Alan Turing in the weeks and months leading to his death? These are all germane matters because we do know a fragment. We know that the security services withdrew Alan Turing's security clearance so he could no longer work at GCHQ. We know that the United States government barred him from visiting the country as a security risk. I simply want to know what information and role there was for the security services in this country in that matter. I was denied that information. I was told it was top secret, it was sensitive, the government does not disclose such matters. Now, I'm not saying the security services had any role in Alan Turing's death, but they may have. Maybe the pressure and threats by the security services on him contributed to his depression and bad state of mind that led him to commit suicide. I think we, the public, have a right to know. The government says this information is sensitive, we do not discuss and disclose matters of security service operation. Well, of course, I wasn't asking for security service operations material. I was simply asking for the historical evidence about the content. You know, I would say that as a general rule, of course, operational matters of the security services, the police and so on, there's no requirement and no justification for them normally to be disclosed. Obviously, those things do need to be kept relatively secret. But other things, the actual policy, who the security services are targeting and why, in some instances, that may be useful and rightful information for people to know. We've also had just recently information on the Sikh genocide in 1984 that the British government had contact with the government of India about the handling of the Sikh presence in the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And the British government, or possibly the SAS, was involved in some kind of advice and discussions with the Indian government. There's an internal inquiry. It was perfunctory. I don't believe it's revealed the true facts. I think all those documents should now be placed in the public domain so we, the public, can assess them and look at them. But the government is holding back. The government is holding back. For me, the bottom line is that the governments are public servants. They serve us. We have a right to know. The public interest is a really important fundamental principle in a democracy. It must be defended. It must be protected. You know, things that affect the public has a right to know. Any refusal to disclose must be necessary and proportionate. Must be limited to genuine matters of state security where potentially lives will be at risk. So we're not asking for the names of every MI5 and MI6 agent and where they're operating and precisely what they're doing, but we would like to know what are the general rules in which the security services operate, and what was, for example, their role in what appears to have been the framing of 2 Pakistan human rights activists in this country on trumped-up charges of terrorism. What was the collusion between the British security services and the rogue state of Pakistan and its intelligence and security services that led to these 2 innocent men being framed on terrorism charges, which could have resulted in them being locked up for many years, if not for life? To this day, we're not allowed to know. We're not allowed to know, even though evidence has emerged, and had emerged at the time even, that this was a setup by the Pakistani security and intelligence services, in particular the ISI. The miners' strike, another classic example, has just come out that all along the government did have a plan to close most mining villages and coal mines in this country. The government's plan was to shut down most of the mining industry. That was known, that was a government secret plan at the time of the miners' strike. We, the people, had a right to know that. The government should have the guts and honesty to tell us that was its plan. And if we'd known, I think a lot of people would have taken a different view about the miners' strike and their cause. The final point I'd say is that the principle is that unless there are compelling reasons to the contrary, the public has a right to know. And that if we are in doubt, we should err on the side of the public's right to know. The secret state, the strong state, is a threat and a menace to democracy. Open government, freedom of information, the public's right to know is fundamental to an effective, functioning democracy. Thank you.
Anita, thank you very much indeed. Opposing the motion, delighted to introduce you to my colleague in Nottingham Law School, Tom Lewis. Tom has been a reader in law since 2009. He teaches public law and human rights at undergraduate and at postgraduate level. He's actively engaged in research in the fields of constitutional law and human rights, and is especially interested in the rights of freedom to expression and freedom of religion and belief. Tom is also the director of Nottingham Law School's Centre for Conflict, Rights and Justice. I know he's very excited to be here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Lewis.
Thank you very much, Becky, and thank you, Peter. I'd like to start, really, to stress that I'm a passionate believer in human rights and freedom of expression and democracy. And for that reason, I suppose my underlying instincts, when faced with this motion, would have been to support it, actually. So imagine my dismay when I agreed to take part in this debate and was told that Peter Tatchell had got in first, and I'd have to oppose the motion. So not only would I be up against one of the greatest campaigners for human rights of his generation, but also I'd have to speak in favour of a cause I didn't believe in. What a nightmare. But then I got to thinking, and actually, on sober reflection, there are some really good reasons why you should vote against this motion. But first of all, and forgive me, any of my law students are here, I'd like to talk a little bit about the reasons we value freedom of expression in the first place. Why do we have this right, this human right to freedom of expression? And over the centuries, several rationales have been offered. In 1859, John Stuart Mill, the famous English philosopher, in his book On Liberty, argued that freedom of speech and free debate and a free market of ideas was the only way that society could progress and that we could reach the truth, that we could achieve societal progress. And others have argued that free speech and freedom of expression is vital to us as individuals for our self-fulfillment and our autonomy, so that we can forge our own path, fully aware of the options that are available to us, to get inspiration and ideas. And it's only possible if speech is free. But perhaps, most importantly, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is vital for democracy. It's essential that people in a democracy have a wide range of information, as wide a range as possible, to exercise their democratic responsibilities, to hold the government to account, to reveal abuse of power, to vote in the government and vote them out if they're rubbish. Just want to quote a bit of law here. Lord Steyn, one of our greatest law lords, said in a case in 1999, freedom of speech is the lifeblood of democracy. The free flow of information and ideas informs political debate. It's a safety valve. People are more ready to accept decisions that go against them if they can, in principle, seek to influence them. It acts as a brake on the abuse of power by public officials. It facilitates the exposure of errors in the governance and administration of justice of the country. Freedom of expression and freedom of democracy are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. It's no accident that when the dictator seizes power, the first thing to go is freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Once that goes, once criticism is stifled, once there is no scrutiny, then anything can happen. It's all up for grabs. Human rights can be breached with impunity, and there's no one left to criticise. So, democracy and free speech are bulwark institutions and rights which protect everything else. Without them, we're all at risk. But sometimes, in order to protect the very democracy which protects us, we need to restrict and bridle freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And in short, I'll argue that this motion goes too far for three interrelated reasons. Firstly, the first argument is about freedom of expression and democracy, and this meaning of this term, this slippery term, public interest. Second, I'm going to talk about the role of the press in the modern world. And thirdly, in Global Week, I'm going to talk about the role of technology and countries less democratic than we are. My first point is to do with this phrase, public interest, and its relationship with freedom of speech. And again, apologies to my students because I'm talking about a bit of law here. Only a tiny bit. When my children call each other names, or they get called names at school, I say, well, don't worry kids, it's alright. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And I'm lying to them because they can. Words hurt us. They make us sad, they make us angry, they can embarrass us, they can humiliate us, they reveal our intimate private lives, they can damage our reputations, and they can cause us profound, prolonged and deep offence. Now, of course, the democratic constitutional state, which as Peter reminds us, is there for us, doesn't have any of these private interests. There's no privacy in the government. It's only there for us, in our interest, to protect us, to benefit us. And sometimes, in a democracy, there may be a public interest in sensitive information being put into the public domain. I accept. But there will very often be an equally strong or stronger public interest going the other way. Sometimes there'll be a strong democratic interest in not publishing sensitive information. Sometimes the protection of democracy itself requires information to be kept confidential and not to be splashed all over the newspapers and the web. In short, the idea of the public interest cuts both ways. And we can see this when we look at human rights itself. I have here a copy of the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, 1950. And Article 10 of the European Convention protects the right to freedom of expression. And the first paragraph conveys the right. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This includes the right to impart and receive ideas and information. But paragraph 2 of Article 10, the human right to freedom of expression, expressly allows for restrictions on freedom of expression to take place. It starts off, since freedom of expression carries with it duties and responsibilities, sticks and stones may break our bones and words can hurt us. In particular, restrictions can be imposed under paragraph 2 of Article 10 in the interests of national security, public safety, preventing crime and protecting other people's rights. As long as the restriction is in law, it's prescribed by law, in other words, people know where they stand in relation to what they say and what punishments might occur as a result. And as long as it's necessary in a democratic society. In other words, as long as the restriction is proportionate to the end which is sought, the legitimate aim which is sought to be achieved. Now, the European Court of Human Rights, which I can remind you is hardly a state-friendly institution. Just think of the recent decisions against the UK in respect to prisoner voting, for example, or in respect of whole life tariffs, upon which there's a current dispute between the Strasbourg Court and British courts. That court has held that it's legitimate for states to limit freedom of expression in the interest of national security or to protect confidential information, as long as those restrictions are proportionate. And the UK courts have done the same thing. Lord Bingham, Tom Bingham, one of our greatest and most humane judges and a staunch and passionate defender of human rights, gave the leading judgment in a case in the early noughties involving the MI5 spy David Shaler. Shaler made allegations about the behaviour of MI5 and allegations of criminality and a potential plot to kill Colonel Gaddafi. And he was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, 1989. And actually fled to France, and the French refused to deport him or extradite him because it would be a political prosecution if he got sent back. And he actually appeared on Have I Got News For You? And I was seeing it. And he was put, because he was in France, they put him on a television monitor next to Paul Merton. He took part throughout the show on a television monitor. Now, Lord Bingham, in that case, held that the prosecution and conviction of Shaler did not violate his free speech rights. And the Official Secrets Act was not incompatible with Article 10 of the ECHR. Essentially, he said, if you've got an allegation about illegal government activity, you don't have to go straight to the press. There are other avenues available in order to curtail abuse of power, short of a worldwide thrusting of the material into the public domain. Not least, there was the possibility of seeking internal redress, of going to the police, going to the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Secretary of State, and if they could do nothing, there was a residual right of the courts, of judicial review. Now, personally, I've got a lot in common with what Peter says. I have no problem, actually, with information about serious human rights abuses and serious criminality coming out of the public domain. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Mass surveillance by the security services, torture, gross breaches of human rights, extraordinary rendition, let it out. I don't have a problem. But there are many, many, many areas of sensitive state information where disclosure would lead to serious damage. And the motion is far too wide and risks damage to our democratic institutions and processes. 3 examples. Firstly, international relations. Think about the Good Friday Accord. Think about the sensitive negotiations that were taking place in order to bring an end to decades of troubles in the north of Ireland. Incredibly. Imagine if there'd been disclosures about those negotiations at the time. Imagine the ruckus there would have been. Imagine if the stuff had come out about people getting amnesties, suspected terrorists getting amnesties, that's come out recently. We'd have been plunged back into bloodshed. It was completely right, that kind of information stays confidential. How much time have you?
I
Sorry.
do know the answer to that. You have 9 minutes left. You're in the zone. You have 9 minutes.
Thank you, sorry, I was working my own floor. Or imagine debates in cabinet. Imagine cabinet discussion. Or discourse between ministers and civil servants over sensitive issues like the economy, or defence, or the environment, or healthcare. If nothing can be said in confidence, because it all gets placed in the public domain, no one will ever say anything. No one will ever be able to speak frankly or candidly ever again. Government will be paralysed with fear of revelation, fear of revelations. People will be walking on eggshells, worried that their advice will come out down the line. Final example, imagine a few years ago there was the NMR outbreak, the NMR controversy, and a paper had been written that having this vaccine could lead to autism in children. Imagine that hadn't been a publicly published paper, but it had been an internal report in government, a confidential report to government, that actually turned out to be wrong, erroneous on the science. Imagine that being leaked to the press. Imagine the panic. Imagine the alleged allegations of cover-up. Parents withdrawing their children from the NMR programme, and a consequent decline in public health, an increase in measles, mumps and rubella as a direct consequence of that. To summarise, the motion's too wide. Public interest in a democracy itself very often goes the other way in favour of keeping information confidential and against putting it into the public domain. My second point is related to the role of the press in the modern world. Now, the European Court of Human Rights, the body which adjudicates upon the European Convention, and also constitutional courts in the United States and the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, stress again and again the vital public watchdog role of the press. And I agree. I completely agree. But just remember something about the press. The press is composed of corporations, owned largely by private individuals, and shareholders driven by profit, driven by the need to sell stories to an all-consuming public. Often, in order to make money, to sell more copy, they will happily blur the distinction between what is in the public interest and what is interesting to the public. All sorts of things are interesting to the public and result in lots and lots of newspapers being sold and the profits of Rupert Murdoch going up that are not in the public interest in the sense of being for the benefit of democracy, as the Leveson inquiry and report graphically demonstrate. I pose this stark question: do we really want the custodians of our liberty to be unelected, unaccountable, profit-driven people like Rupert Murdoch or Rebecca Brooks or Andy Coulson or Piers Morgan, or, for that matter, self-appointed libertarian internet heroes such as Edward Snowden and Julian Assange? At least with the politicians in a democracy, we can kick them out if they turn out to be rubbish. We have no such luxury with the press barons. And thirdly, my final point, and I might even finish early.
I think you will.
God.
Slow down.
Yeah, slow down. Relates to this idea of Global Week and modern technology. Now, in the 1980s, when I was a student, how could it let one go?
No, it's a lie. You've lost a decade.
There was a major controversy over a book called Spycatcher, and a protracted, very protracted legal dispute. And Spycatcher was a book written by a former MI5 officer, Peter Wright, living in Australia, and he made allegations about the security services, again. A bit like WikiLeaks or the Snowden files of its day, really. And the book was banned in the United Kingdom, and the serialisation of the book by British newspapers was banned as well. But it was sold in the United States, because the United States has this very strong protection of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. It was the best-selling book at Kennedy Airport. And I remember people brought it into the United Kingdom, and they didn't try and stop it being brought in. And I remember students, rather ostentatiously in the university bar, basically having a copy of Spycatcher and kind of reading, look at me, I've got a copy of Spycatcher, and showing what radical people they were. And kind of that's the point, really. The book Spycatcher was a physical bit of paper, printed on presses, clunking Victorian presses, bound into books, having to be physically transported across the world for the information to be communicated and disseminated. And today, things are immeasurably different. Within a few seconds, information can be disseminated globally at the merest tickle of a laptop keyboard. It's far, far, far more dangerous today. Now this week we're celebrating Global Week. And when we look around this world of ours, we see how many countries are not proper democracies and do not permit freedom of expression. How many of our fellow human beings live under repressive regimes? Now, in many countries, people cannot vote in their governments or vote them out, even in theory. And in many countries, they claim to be democratic in name, but in reality, they're not, with the same leaders elected time after time with 90% majority vote. And you can bet your shiny iPad that Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Vladimir Putin in Russia will be rubbing their hands in delight at the prospect of our sensitive state information being beamed directly into their iPhones, whilst they themselves maintain an iron grip on their own state information. In Global Week, it's worth remembering that in many countries of the world, we would not be able to have this debate at all. At least without Peter, Leah, Harry and myself sneaking out the back door afterwards, scared of being arrested. There are a lot of dangerous states out here, and on balance, we are not one of them. Sometimes the public interest in democracy and the public interest in protecting democracy requires that we keep sensitive information out of the public domain. And I'd seriously advise you to vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce you now to Leah Wright, who is a final year student reading Business Management and Entrepreneurship, and is also the Tournament Secretary for the Nottingham Trent University Debating Society. Leah will be speaking in favour of the motion.
Thank you to Peter and thank you to Tom. So first of all today, I'm going to go and just kind of slightly try and rebut some of Tom's points, and then I'll go into just a general discussion about why we think politics, particularly in the UK, is particularly a problem at the moment, and why we think that more information sharing from government is going to help that problem. Okay, so first of all, a couple of things that Tom said. First of all, he was talking about, one of the things he was talking about is the role of the press. I think that the problem is that, like, particularly if governments are able to, or basically entrench that they should share more information, then surely, then in that case, the role of the press is then diminished slightly. The power over the public is then diminished. The ability for the Rupert Murdochs of this world to be able to corrupt certain individuals in Parliament is then diminished to a certain degree. Because they are not, the ability is not in the power to discuss these things with the public anymore. It is more to do with the way in which politicians discuss with the public, rather than the way the media interacts with them. Particularly also, we've got this idea of why that individuals, particularly say that we might have some, that we might be scared to say things. But I might be scared. You know what? I don't really care if Boris Johnson is scared. He should be scared because he's going to get voted out if he says something or says something particularly wrong or he says something incorrect. What we should be doing is should be making our individuals that are in Parliament accountable for what they do and what they say. We should not be entrenching, as public, being able to say that you can say or do what you want because we've given you that power. To be able to say to our government, no, we don't believe that is true, or no, we don't believe that is the thing that we want in our society, and therefore we are able to say no at elections. We think that it's particularly problematic when you have these sorts of issues within society, the government is not releasing that information, then the public don't know about it. And this is what the main issue that I'm going to be talking about today is about why we think that governments, particularly this one, in general, when we should be more accountable, and why politics is bad in the moment. Really fun? Okay, so we don't, particularly, we think the government should be held accountable for the reasons I've just said. Right, why is this? Because the fact is that we live in a democracy. When we are going over to the Middle East and saying, why don't you have democracy? It is basically heinous that the British government can say that when we don't have true democracy ourselves. When you have things such as GCHQ and Edward Snowden, what happens is that in the public, the British public became like distant from politics, became the idea that they're distant from politicians. The problem is, it's not this idea that we have in the government at the moment that where we just think that government is about white, middle-class males. That's not about that. The reason why the public is so distant from politicians is because our governments are not giving us the information that we require. Because of the media increase, because of the increase of the internet, we're able to get more information. Because of these things are coming out now, because of that interaction that we're getting, that we believe that we have this sort of problem with our governments because they're not sharing the information that we need. We come the idea that these are deceptive. The governments are trying to hide secrets from us, and that is when public become detached from politicians. That's why we get lower voter turnout. If we have lower voter turnout, that is when we don't have true democracy. And that's why we can't go to the Middle East and say, why don't you have democracy? Because we don't have it ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, within the West, particularly in the UK and with the USA. Because keeping these individual things right. Okay. The issue that we have in within politics is because we want to be able to engage with politics. People want to know what's going on in their lives. They want to be able to see patterns, and they want to be able to see how their lives are going to shape up. Like, politics affects every single thing that people do, and people want to be engaged with it, but they're not currently. The problem is that individuals, in this case, if we say something like a quote from Tony Benn, we don't have the freedom to choose, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have the freedom to choose if we don't have the information available to us. So you can't decide on a particular party within the UK if you don't know that information based on the governments that are in front of you. If we create this culture that, like, particular politicians can basically withhold information, just as the example that Tom gave you, that if you go to Secretary of State, they can still withhold that information, still get it into the public domain. You're not going to be able to get that situation. In society now, we should be able to tell our government, no, we want to know that information. If it is in the public interest, for instance, like the Troubles, if it's going to cause mass violence, then no, of course it's not in the public interest, because there's going to be killings. If, in the sense that this information, such as the miners' strikes, as Peter already mentioned, individuals should have been able to know this information, to know about their lives, otherwise they would not, they could have made those different voting choices or been able to decide certain things such as campaigns, etc. If we don't have this information, ladies and gentlemen, we are not able to make those informed choices. And we should, in today's society, as Tom already told you, with the increase in the media, we should have that information. Otherwise, we are going to become more and more distant from our governments. And that is why today I am in proposition. Thank you.
Amazement to this second. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, I'd like to introduce Harry White, who is against the motion. Harry is a final year politics student and he's also president of the NTU Debating Society. When you're ready.
Okay, so I'd like to open with a case of Stephen King's book that was produced in America. And this book was produced, it was a story about a kid that goes on a rampage and shoots at half the people in his school. There were 3 cases in America where this happened, and the kids that did commit these crimes were in possession of this book. I would submit today that in fact there is a time in which we can recall information. We can say that some information, some ideas, some things like that should not be expressed, and some things should be kept within certain organisations. The book was eventually recorded. So I have 2 points I'm going to bring today. Firstly, like why I think the motion is kind of troubling and also kind of tricky to sort of prop this. And secondly, again, talking about the role of the press, I think it's important. Firstly, I've got 2 things I want to say about this. Peter talks about the idea that if there are very, very strong, compelling reasons that we shouldn't, and that would be the circumstance which we wouldn't reveal this information. However, like, what are these compelling reasons? Are these compelling reasons when we know that it's going to cause a magnitude of harm towards many groups of people? Which groups of people? How many deaths? How many deaths quantify too much harm? Like, that hasn't been laid out for us today, right? Therefore, we have to say that under the circumstances, there is no workable way we can say what is compelling and what is reasonable in order to release this information. Secondly, we have from Leah that this idea that more information will lead to more engagement. I would submit to everyone here that if the state suddenly turned around and said, "Hi guys, we've been hiding all this information, but trust us enough to vote," they're probably not going to vote. So therefore more likely to be entrenched away from the political system. They're more likely to think that these guys are lying, why am I to believe that this is the only information they're holding back from me? And therefore they're more likely to be disengaged in politics, and therefore withdraw further, but actually harm the problem further and not actually help it. But firstly, the ambiguity within the motion, right? So what is the public interest? Is it a number of hashtags? Is it a number of referendums or gov polls? Like, I would submit to you that like hashtags doesn't really work anyway. But like, let's talk about like referendums. So like referendums will have poor turnouts anyway because of elections, because of disengagement. And the fact is that you have to reveal some of the subject matter in order to have a referendum. You couldn't exactly ask, do you want to know some state secrets? You'd have to ask, do you want to know who your local paedophile is? That would be a state secret you'd have to give out, right? Therefore, inherently, you're already giving out some of the information, and therefore it's pointless having that referendum, because you've already submitted the fact that we're holding back the fact that we know where all the paedophiles live. Therefore, it's inherently already bad that the state is then already revealing its hand before it's even had to vote, right? And also the fact is that people would be voting on something they don't necessarily know about, because then you'd have an ignorant result. Also, YouGov polls, similar problem with the fact that not everyone would take it, therefore it wouldn't be representative, therefore it wouldn't exactly be falling into its effect, and of course the idea of like, you know, not everyone is going to know exactly what they're asking the questions for, and the questions would have to be leading towards those state secrets in order to get a genuine response. Right? So there's no line in which you can recognise this idea of public interest. There's no line to say that public interest would be there unless we identify the subject area to the participants. So then I move on to the next line of it, the sensitive information. Right? What is this? Is this weapon deployment? Is this domestic security threats? Location of criminals? Is it who are we investigating? I mean, Peter talked about the idea of spying, who we're spying on. Now, if we told everyone who we're spying on, it's not going to make spying very effective. In fact, it's going to make it very disineffective. No one is going to have any idea what's going on behind, let's say, in Russia with Putin and things like that, which you probably should know more about, since they might be invading Ukraine. It's kind of going to be bad. Right? So also the fact is, like, if you're going to have these pieces of information in a broad context that will threaten national security in the name of this, it's going to be named sensitive information because it is sensitive towards the public and towards the security of that state. And if you have a system that is protecting us and saying we're not going to reveal this information because it threatens you, the integrity of the state, and also our national security, it's probably a good thing. This remains within the remit of the state and not put out there to the public domain. Right? And this leads me on to what the meaning of the public domain is. It may seem obvious, but is it? Do we tweet it? Do we say, by the way, guys, the missiles will be moved to Essex, hashtag British security details? No, you wouldn't do that. You're more likely to reveal it in, let's say, a press release, right? But here's a reason why this is a damaging, not necessarily effective. Now, in Ukraine, obviously, most people know there's bad things going on. That was the 4th news item that was most clicked on the BBC News website. You know what the first one was? A snake eating a crocodile. Now that simply shows that people would not be interested enough to watch the press release. Therefore, the release from the government or wherever. That means they're more likely to read it in institutions like the press, which, as Tom brought you, polarise everything, because at the end of the day, the press are there to sell papers. And if they can put a dramatic headline across the top and say, yeah, and show a picture of dead Gaddafi or something like that, they're more likely to do that than put forward the truth, right? So this leads me on to why I think the press and not necessarily the best outlets. So the idea the media is a major way that the information we put out there, that the threat of polarisation would definitely exist. We can say that actually the media outlets that would come forward with this inherently tell us what we should care about and what we shouldn't care about. They're telling us, by putting things on the front page, putting things on the back page, what is more important news and what is less important news. What gets more coverage, what gets less coverage. For example, Ukraine, loads of coverage, but in fact in China, where people were hacked to death on the subway, no coverage. Right? Therefore, the press are inherently telling us what we should care about more. Right? In this situation, when they come forward with a piece of state information that is totally legitimate, is totally horrible and everyone thinks they should know, right? They're going to put a polarised spin on that, and therefore we're going to get a polarised idea of what that is. So therefore all the harms that they bring you, and all the idea of finding the truth, won't happen because the press will polarise what you hear, the press will only put out what will sell the papers, and therefore because of that, the information will not spread. It will not have an informed democracy. In fact, we will have a disinformed democracy, which is a bigger threat to holding back the information than the ideas that they put forward. And that's why I'm proud to oppose this motion.
I'm going to ask Peter Tatchell to summarise his position for 2 minutes, like a right of reply, and then for Tom to summarise your position for 2 minutes, and then I'll open to the audience with any questions, which will limit to a total of 15 minutes. Peter.
I think on our side, we agree that not all state information should be put in the public domain. We agree that it shouldn't all be publicly available. There are certain circumstances where it is justified and proportionate to withhold information. So, for example, was that of naming MI5 agents and their operations. We're not expecting that to be put in the public domain. But we are expecting the policy framework and particular policy decisions relating to that to be put in the public domain, in the sense of that the government is doing X, Y, Z because of ABC. We want to know what the general policy is and what its justification is. Our view is that on balance, most state secrecy is unjustified. We've seen state secrecy invoked to prevent the revelation of hospitals with high mortality rates. People have not been allowed to know until there's been great public pressure and demands from MPs, not allowed to know which of the hospitals where patients are dying in extraordinary numbers. The cover-up over East Staffordshire was truly shocking, an example of how state secrecy works against the public interest. We also see that in the cover-up over corruption in British arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia. It is absolutely incompatible with democracy for corruption to be tolerated, and even worse, for it to be blatantly covered up by successive governments. So we're saying the balance is wrong. We're not saying no revelations. We're not saying that some revelations are unjustified. We're saying the balance is wrong. There is too much state secrecy.
That's your 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks. Just to very briefly summarise my position. Sometimes the public interest in a democracy requires information not to be put in the public domain to protect all of us and to protect democracy itself, which is the bulwark for protection of human rights. And my categories, I think, would be broader than those proposed by Peter and Leah. Secondly, beware the press. They're run by modern-day barons, unelected and unaccountable, and love to blur the distinction between the public interest and interesting to the public in the interest of selling more papers and making a profit. And thirdly, think how Kim Jong-un and Vladimir will be loving to find out all about